Welcome to Design Domination, where you'll gain confidence, clarity, and a competitive edge in a crowded marketplace so you can dominate your competition. Hi, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Colleen Grotzer, and in this episode of Design Domination, I'm going to talk about how to choose fonts for a project. And I mean from a technical standpoint, what you need to consider. Stick around to get resources for where to get legitimate free fonts, some surprising reasons you should use certain free fonts, and accessibility concerns with certain types of fonts. Now, I'm going to use the word font since most designers use that term interchangeably with typeface. Technically, the term should be typeface when you're talking about the family, such as Helvetica, like as a whole. Helvetica regular, Helvetica bold, Helvetica oblique, on the other hand, are the actual fonts. But okay, whatever. You know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about fonts. Okay, so this is going to be more about technical and legal considerations as opposed to how to select the right looking typeface for your project. Okay, so first off, where you get your typefaces matters because you want to get quality fonts that have been optimized for readability and consistency and are legally allowed to be used in a project. So you want to narrow your search to some solid sources. There are a ton of free font sites out there, and I know you know of them, and many of them are not legit, okay? And it might be tempting to download any fonts that you can find for free. But hey, I've done it. But like the saying goes, you get what you pay for. You know, the other thing is that you can't be sure that the font is not a stolen copy of a legally sold font. Okay, early on in my career, I would get so excited about free fonts. I would gather them up wherever I could find them, right? I built this huge inventory of them. And then years ago, many years ago, I got rid of most of them, okay, for a lot of reasons. Okay, so I'm going to give you some reputable font sources. Okay, one is Adobe Fonts, but then, of course, you're tied to Adobe. Another one is Google Fonts. Another one is SIL Fonts, V Fonts, Collectivo with 3 L's and 3 T's in that one, FontShare, Open Foundry, and Font Squirrel. And what's really funny is that Font Squirrel, they even scream free fonts, legit free and quality in their homepage title that shows up when you search in Google. Now, there are a ton more resources on the Open Font License website. Okay, so let's talk about font licensing because this is super important to pay attention to. You do not want to get yourself or your clients in hot water. First off, make sure the fonts that you choose for a client project can be used commercially, not just for personal use, which defeats the purpose, right? Okay, second, make sure the license says that the font can be embedded. Imagine working so hard on a project, picking out that perfect font, and then you go and export it to a PDF, like for a proof or a print file, right? And then you get a warning message that you can't do that because the font doesn't allow it. Now, sure, you could convert all the text to that's in that typeface to outlines, but that's super tedious to do. And then you have to go select it everywhere, you know, and you won't be able to edit the text after that. So hopefully you don't save over that file. And then that's also, though, circumventing the terms of the license, which is not a good idea. Now, if you're going to be creating an EPUB file, you're going to also want to make sure that you can use the font there, too. Now, a lot of designers will provide clients the fonts as part of the source design files after a project is done. And I don't recommend sending native files at all, at least not unless you're paid for them, you know, or unless it's a work for hire situation, in which case you would send them the source files. But unless a font's license says that you can share the fonts, you should not provide the fonts to clients. They should be paying for their own license. Another thing to consider is font formats. Those are really important to consider. Okay, one type of font format, which you might have heard of, is OpenType. Now, choosing OpenType fonts that use Unicode character encoding is the best. Now, I don't know for sure if all OpenType fonts use Unicode character encoding or not, but you want to look for OpenType fonts. Okay, this is important because these kinds of fonts are going to include hundreds of thousands of characters and glyphs. And that makes using them better for foreign language characters, accent marks, and math, and other types of symbols. Now, to compare, PostScript and TrueType fonts that we've used in the past, they use only 256 characters maximum. Okay, so that's a big difference, right? Hundreds of thousands versus 256. Now, with PostScript and TrueType, what happens is that, and you may have encountered this, you might have to resort to using another typeface in order to type certain characters properly, right? To have them appear properly. Now, you know what I mean if you've ever seen a missing glyph in InDesign where it shows as a rectangle. Now, the other benefit to using OpenType fonts and having an expanded number of characters is for accessibility. So that's from a technical, not a visual standpoint. You may or may not have ever noticed this if you've created an accessible document, but I see this a lot with client files. A lot of times what happens is that the designer will use the popular Zapf Dingbats font for like a square bullet, right? Or maybe for like stars for bullets. Well, the square bullet is created by typing a lowercase n in the Zapf Dingbats typeface. Well, in looking at the page in InDesign or in the PDF, it looks like a square, and that was what was intended, right? But in the tags tree, the square bullet appears as a lowercase n. Why would this happen? Well, it's because the font is being used to create the bullet rather than using a glyph character that it already exists in that typeface. So in other words, it's just the letter N styled with the font to look like a square, right? But in its code, in its core, it's really still an N. Okay, so it's important to use the correct glyph or character so that assistive technology will interpret it correctly. In this case, for example, instead of someone that uses a screen reader hearing the word bullet and then the line of text, they will hear N and the line of text, and then so forth for each list item. So that's completely different, and it would be confusing. Now, if you use the right character and then change fonts, if that font has that glyph, it will show it. You know, it's like you can type A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and you can change the font from Arial to Helvetica, let's say, right? But those letters still appear as what they are, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Now, another plus to OpenType fonts is their cross-platform use. And I really love this about them. So the same font files, which are .otf, those can be used on Mac, and they can also be used on Windows. Now, this actually, I think, is a big selling point for when you are going to design new branding for a client, because they'll be able to have consistency. So, for instance, you can use the same fonts in InDesign on a Mac, you know, and they can use the same fonts in a Word document or their presentation slides. You know, if they're a large company and they use both Mac and Windows, that's a huge benefit for them. Now, a lot of times you can find free OpenType fonts that you can use in print and for digital documents and also on the web so that you have even more consistency. And again, this might be a consideration when you want to ensure that the same typefaces are going to be used for print, digital documents, and presentations and on the website, right? Everywhere. I hope this information was helpful and that it will guide you in selecting fonts in your next project. Now, in a future episode, I will go into selecting typefaces from a visual standpoint as well. But for more typeface talk right now, you can check out episode 20, Typeface Design and Inspiration, where I talked with type designer Fabio Duarte Martins, and episode 31 on typographic typos. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. If this content was helpful, you can support the podcast by buying me a coffee. It might actually end up being a glass of wine or some tea, but you can go to buymeacoffee.com/creativeboost.